So I'm lucky enough to be the director of the Churchill Archives Centre, which is located in the grounds of Churchill College at the University of Cambridge. And the Archive Centre was purpose-built to house the personal papers of Sir Winston Churchill. And I don't think it will surprise anyone here to know that that is an enormous collection. You're talking about some 2,500 boxes, an estimated 1 million items. Everything from his childhood letters and school reports through to his final writings. But of course, that's just the start of the endeavour at the Archive Centre. We also have the papers of some 640 other individuals, politicians, diplomats, military leaders, and scientists of the modern era. We're the one place where you'll find Winston Churchill, Ernest Bevin, Margaret Thatcher, Neil Kinnock, and Gordon Brown sitting comfortably side by side. But tonight I'm going to talk about Churchill, because Churchill, of course, is my own area of interest. Quite interesting talking about Churchill in a junior school, because, of course, immediately reminds me of his school reports from his first school, St George's School in Ascot. They weren't very good. He was a willful, rebellious school child. This was a very strict Victorian school, and the two didn't meet. So the school reports contain comments like, "Conduct has been exceedingly bad. He cannot be trusted to behave himself anywhere." Is always in some scrape or other. There's even one school report where the headmaster actually writes that Churchill lacks ambition. I think you can say many things about Churchill the man, but not that he lacked ambition. It is also, of course, a pleasure to be speaking to you on the 18th of June. As members of an historical society, you will be aware that today is the 211th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. Winston Churchill would certainly have been aware of that fact. But it's also the 86th anniversary of Churchill's finest hour speech, his address to the nation in the aftermath of the fall of France in 1940, which was delivered in Parliament before being broadcast that evening over the BBC, and which must rank surely as one of the most important political speeches of modern times. And in the Archive Centre, amongst Churchill's papers, we have his original speaking notes. And that seemed to me an excellent place to start. So, let me explain a little bit about how Churchill's oratory worked. The way that he liked to work was to dictate. He would dictate, perhaps pacing up and down the room, maybe a glass of whiskey in one hand, a cigar in the other, and his duty secretaries would be on hand to take down his words on a state-of-the-art silent typewriter. And they would take them down and they would type them out, first of all, in normal typescript, double-spaced. And Churchill would then go through making annotations, corrections, amendments, and quite often, where these drafts survive, you can see that he's been through not just once, but twice or several times, and you can see all the changes he's making. And you can guess at the reason for those changes. Is it because of a piece of new information? Is it because he wants to change the way the speech is sounding? So they give you a wonderful introduction, I think, a wonderful insight into Churchill's thought process. But then, what I think is unique to Churchill is that when the speech is more or less in its final form, it's taken away by the duty secretary and it's retyped. And it's retyped at about this sort of size, A5 size, so that it fits comfortably into his jacket pocket or his hand. It's tagged together so that he can't lose his page. And then it is set out on the page in this blank verse format, like poetry. And of course, when you see it on the page like this, you see immediately why Churchill did this. Because it gives him the rhythm, it gives him the emphasis, it gives him the pauses. It's almost impossible to read these pages and not hear it being delivered in Churchill's voice. And here you're looking at the penultimate page of the Finest Hour speech of the 18th of June 1940, and you can see there that it ends at the bottom, "What General Weygand calls the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin." And then it goes on to this sort of final page with this almost sort of Shakespearean language, echoes of Henry V. "Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization." Building up to the ending, "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and Commonwealth lasts for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour." That's the original. Those are the notes that he would have had in his hand on the 18th of June. And you can see some of his last minute changes and corrections. So above "What General Weygand calls the Battle of France is over," he's added in his Churchillian red pen, "All shall be restored." And of course, when Churchill delivered those lines on the 18th of June 1940, he was your MP. But of course, he was also more than that, because he was also president of this society, a role that he assumed in 1939. And just think of the number of other things that he had on his mind in 1939, but that's the original letter of invitation that survives in the archive for Churchill to become the president of the Chingford Antiquarian and Historical Society. I hope somewhere in your own archive you've got the signed copy of his reply, but that's the carbon copy that survives in his papers accepting it. Of course, he served as your president from 1939 until his death in 1965, long after Chingford had passed out of his constituency. And I think this interest in history is one of the things that makes Churchill so unique, and of course one of the things that makes his archive so strong. He's someone who, it's not just about actions, it's also about words. This was the man, after all, who stood up in the British Parliament just after the Second World War and famously declared that he thought it would be best for all parties to leave the past to history, especially as I propose to write that history myself. And write it, of course, he certainly did. His war memoirs run to 6 volumes. In fact, he published some 40 works in 70 volumes during his lifetime, and ultimately won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953 for his contribution to the written and, crucially, the spoken word. From young war correspondent to best-selling elder statesman, Churchill's whole career was underpinned by words. He used them to fund his lifestyle, but also to advance his political views. When times were hard, he lived from pen to mouth, and he used words to overcome setbacks and also to dominate the political agenda. Small wonder then that his archive is so large. But today I'm going to focus particularly on an often overlooked part of that archive and the collection, namely Churchill's relationship with his constituency, because he was MP for Epping, or West Essex as it was originally known, from 1924 to 1945. And then, when the constituency was split, he was MP for Woodford until his retirement from Parliament in 1964. So my focus this evening is going to be primarily on the period most relevant to your local history here in Chingford, and that's the turbulent years of the 1920s and 1930s, when Churchill's relationship with his constituents was sometimes difficult, but I would argue that ultimately his constituents proved vital to his political survival. Let me say at the outset, I'm not the first person to have looked at Churchill's role here. There's an excellent short book by David Thomas called Churchill, the Member for Woodford, which I'm sure will be known to some of you, and Sir Martin Gilbert's official biography of Churchill, which runs to 8 volumes with a staggering 23 companion volumes, includes many references to Churchill's political base in this area. But what I hope I can do is what I think all archivists should seek to do, and let some of the documents in Churchill's own papers speak for themselves. There is a whole section or class of constituency correspondence relating to Epping from which I've been able to draw, as well as from speech notes, newspaper articles, and personal letters. But let me say that particularly in this company, I'm very aware of the limitations of this approach. I'm conscious that there may be people here who remember Churchill as a local Essex MP. There's also a risk that I'm going to mangle some of your local and personal names. So feel free to correct me. Am I right? It's Faden Boys? Is that, yeah? Nazing? Yeah, okay, we'll run with those. So at first glance, Churchill and Epping seem natural political bedfellows. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was a child of the establishment, a grandson of the Duke of Marlborough, born at Blenheim Palace, educated at Ascot, Harrow and Sandhurst, and then commissioned into the British cavalry, serving as an officer in India, Cuba, the Sudan, and ultimately South Africa. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had been a charismatic and controversial Conservative politician who'd risen to become Chancellor of the Exchequer under Lord Salisbury, and who'd famously championed taking conservatism to the masses under the banner of Tory democracy, before ending his career with an ill-judged resignation. Indeed, it was Lord Randolph's early death in 1895, aged just 45, that had a profound effect on his oldest son, because it acted as the catalyst for the launch of Winston's own career and helped to propel him into Parliament as the Conservative MP for Oldham in 1900. And the young Winston Churchill was just 25 when he was elected, though he turned 26 by the time he took up his seat in 1901. By any measure, this is a meteoric rise, and it seemed clear that Winston was destined to assume his father's mantle and that his prospects were bright within the Conservative ranks. The constituency of Epping enjoyed an equally strong Conservative pedigree, for Epping and Chingford have nearly always been Conservative strongholds, and this, of course, is true to the current day. When Churchill was elected as its MP in 1924, the constituency was often still referred to as West Essex, but it had never been anything but a Conservative seat. Which is why I think it's perhaps surprising to note that the first non-Conservative Member of Parliament for the seat of West Essex or Epping was none other than Winston Churchill. Because Churchill in 1924 was not a Conservative. He was a Conservative in all but name. He was shortly to become a Conservative again, but he was standing here in Epping as the constitutionalist candidate. So why? Well, it's true that Churchill began his career as a Conservative. It's often now forgotten that much of his early public career was spent as a Liberal. In 1904, the young MP for Oldham dramatically crossed the floor of the House of Commons, deserting the Tory government ranks to take a seat next to David Lloyd George on the Liberal opposition benches. The Liberals were the main opposition party, with the Labour Party still in its infancy. And the big political issue of the day, the early 20th century equivalent to Brexit, was the question of free trade versus the introduction of protective tariffs. Churchill was a free trader. The Conservatives were adopting protectionism, and Churchill felt he could no longer remain in the party. It was a principled stand, but it was also a highly opportune and well-timed one, because the political tide was swinging against the Conservative Party, and it was the Liberals, including their newest recruit, who became the party of government in 1905. And Churchill then rises rapidly through the Liberal ranks. He serves in Campbell Bannerman's administration as Under Secretary of State for Colonies, before joining Asquith's pre-war Liberal cabinet as President of the Board of Trade and then Home Secretary. And that cartoon depicts Churchill alongside Asquith and Lloyd George at the forefront of the Liberal Party in the Edwardian era. By the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, he was the First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian minister in charge of the largest navy in the world. Though still only 39 years of age, he'd already held 3 of the senior offices of state. He'd also been one of the leading proponents of liberal social reform, introducing unemployment insurance and labour exchanges, and supporting Lloyd George, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, when he brought in his controversial People's Budget. And that budget, with its proposals for increasing taxation on the income of the land of the wealthy classes, led to a constitutional crisis when it was vetoed by the House of Lords. It was bitterly contested by the Conservative Party, many of whom now saw Churchill as a traitor to his background and to his political heritage. So Churchill's road to Epping and his path back to the Conservatives began during the First World War. Dismissed from office over his championing of the disastrous Dardanelles campaign, Churchill serves briefly on the Western Front, commanding a battalion of Royal Scots Fusiliers. His political career, though, is now dependent on the patronage of Lloyd George, who brings him back into his wartime coalition government as Minister for Munitions. And after the war, Lloyd George continues to run a national government, a coalition of his faction of the Liberal Party with the Conservatives. And Churchill was one of the few senior Liberal figures to stay with Lloyd George and serve in it. As Secretary of State for War, then for the colonies, he finds himself working alongside the prominent Conservative leaders of the day, some of whom, like F.E. Smith, were already personal friends. And Churchill's political concerns are also changing. He is a passionate opponent of the new Bolshevik regime in Russia from its birth. He likens the arrival of Lenin in Moscow to the importation of a plague bacillus. And he sees the hand of the Kremlin and the spectre of communism behind the increasing militancy of the British Labour movement at home and the rise of socialism abroad. It's a period that clearly defines and demarcates the limits of Churchill's radicalism. And it's not surprising that Churchill's increasingly vehement and anti-socialist rhetoric begins to cause him problems in his constituency, which at this point is Dundee in Scotland. The large working class population is turning away from liberalism towards socialism and away from Churchill. And in 1922, disaster strikes. Lloyd George's government falls, a general election's called, and Churchill is struck down with appendicitis. His constituency in Dundee turns against him, and in his own words, "In the twinkling of an eye, I found myself without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix." For the first time in 22 years, he's out of the House of Commons. Now, to my mind, one of Churchill's most interesting characteristics is his tenacity, his ability to overcome adversity and to recover from these apparent defeats. It's a recurring motif of his career that sees him come back from such terrible setbacks as the Dardanelles affair of 1915 and the general election defeat of 1945. But his fight back after the Dundee defeat is a difficult one. He stood as a Liberal for the last time in the 1923 general election, when he's defeated as a candidate for West Leicester, before declaring himself a constitutionalist and fighting and almost winning a dramatic by-election for the Abbey division of Westminster. And even though he was standing as an independent and lacked a party machine to support him, he came close to stealing the Westminster seat, later observing, "I was beaten by 40 votes out of nearly 40,000 polled. I must confess I thoroughly enjoyed the fight from start to finish." The Westminster by-election proves beyond doubt that Churchill remains a national figure, and it confirms that he's now closer to the Conservatives than the Liberals. But as Churchill noted, "I'd now been defeated 3 times in succession, Dundee, West Leicester and Westminster, which is why it was a relief to be returned by a majority of 10,000 for West Essex at the end of the general election of 1924. And Churchill was right to express his relief. Victory in Epping marks the end of a tumultuous period of campaigning, and defeat here in Essex in 1924 might have been the end of his political career. But Epping also marks the return of Churchill to the Conservative Party, allegedly prompting the later remark, "Anyone can rat, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat." Certainly, Churchill was helped in Epping by the fact that though he was nominally an independent, he was supported by the local and national Conservative Party machines. The Tory leadership wanted to bring him back into the fold. And after Westminster, they were prepared to help him find a safe Conservative seat. Moreover, it's clear that his strong anti-socialism polled well within the Conservative rank and file in places like Epping. Add to this his strong personality, his high public profile, his oratory, and his already considerable cabinet experience, and you can see why the Epping Conservatives might have wanted to adopt Churchill. Meanwhile, for Churchill, location clearly played a key role. He'd only recently purchased Chartwell, his house in Kent, and after years of northern constituencies in Oldham, Manchester and Dundee, he's clearly looking for a London base that will allow him to concentrate on national issues at Westminster. Epping's not his only option, but after turning down the less safe seat of North Hackney, he formally writes to accept the invitation of the constituency chair, Sir Harry Goshen, on the 11th of September 1924. And the letter hints that one factor in his final decision may have been the ease with which he could motor from Kent to Epping. Then, of course, a very novel mode of transport. As we know, it's not such an easy drive today. Churchill and the local party officers were keen to downplay his liberal past and to stress the candidate's credentials in opposing socialism. So Harry Goshen couldn't attend the critical meeting of the Association Council, but he writes to his deputy, James Hawkey, endorsing Winston and stating that, "I feel that under the existing circumstances, those who have the interests of the country at heart ought to dismiss from their minds all past differences and unite in securing the services of the most able men to combat the menace threatening the country from the extreme section of the Socialist Party." Churchill is then adopted here. In the election campaign, he presents himself as the constitutionalist candidate, but his letter to the electors of Epping gives his wholehearted support to the Conservative Party. And despite worries that not all the Conservatives would turn out for him, or that the Labour Party would withdraw from the field to allow tactical voting for the Liberals to prevent Churchill getting in, it was a convincing victory with that 10,000 majority. And Churchill's relief is palpable. He was back in the Commons, and he wrote in an article a few years later, 4 elections in under 2 years. This is certainly as much as should satisfy anyone, and makes me earnestly hope that I have found a resting place among the glades of Epping that will last me as long as I am concerned with mundane affairs. Now, the contest and the victory were closely followed by those who'd worked with Churchill on the national stage, and one letter that survives in his constituency papers is from T.E. Lawrence, the celebrated Lawrence of Arabia. This picture shows Churchill and Lawrence side by side on camels in front of the pyramids at the time of the Cairo conference in 1921, as Lawrence had been advising Churchill on Arab affairs. And Lawrence writes to Churchill after his election victory here, "This isn't congratulation, it's just the hiss of my excess delight rushing out. You've done it gloriously, all the conditions to your credit. 2 by-elections, 2 books to whet the public appetite, and then this smashing success. Tactically, it seems to me the ground is all in your favour now, only let's hope there will be enemy enough to provide you with exercise. Probably there will be, since some of the very shellback Tories will want cracking occasionally, and their own chiefs are mild." Now, Epping certainly provided Churchill with the permanent resting place he wanted. He was re-elected in 1929, 1931 and 1935. But there was also enough enemy to keep Churchill engaged. At first, that enemy was restricted to the national stage, but as we'll see, ultimately he was forced to fight here in Epping in his own backyard. And some of that opposition would come from those very shellback Tories that Lawrence had so presciently highlighted. But in 1924, Epping had saved Churchill's career. In fact, it provided a springboard to further success, when to Churchill's surprise, he found himself not only back in the Conservative ranks, but also back in a Conservative-dominated national government as Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was 50 years old. Physically, as you can see, he's just beginning to put on weight. His red hair is turning grey, but his biggest challenges are still to come. Churchill's time as MP for Epping falls naturally into 2 phases, broadly synonymous with the 2 decades, the 1920s and the 1930s. From 1924 to 1929, he's Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's restoring the country to the gold standard, probably not a good move. He introduces the tote for gambling. You can argue about whether that's a good move or not. And he leads the government opposition to the general strike of 1926. His appearances in Epping were largely restricted to special occasions, set-piece speeches and meetings. But no doubt it served Epping well to have such a powerful national figure as its Member of Parliament. And while Churchill may have been by inclination a national rather than a local politician, there is no evidence that his office neglected constituency affairs. Indeed, some of the topics covered in our files would not seem out of place in the inbox of your MP today. There's correspondence on greyhound racing, traffic noise, planning issues, pensions, tree protection, vivisection, and even the need to help protect the English sparkling wine industry. I have to say Churchill was probably a bigger advocate for Pol Roger champagne. Churchill was clearly doing something right, because in the general election of October 1931, he increased his majority at Epping to over 20,000. But by this point, he's out of office. Baldwin's government has fallen in 1929, and he's supplementing his reduced political earnings and his lavish lifestyle through the use of his pen. Churchill had started his life as a professional journalist and war correspondent, writing dispatches about his army adventures in Cuba and South Africa. And at times of need, he was able to return to that first vocation. In 1931, he writes for money. He writes about his travels in the United States, his visits to the Civil War battlefields, even what it feels like to be knocked down by a motor car on New York's Fifth Avenue. But he also writes a piece for the Daily Mail on his election fight here at Epping. The piece was certainly good publicity for his campaign, and it shows Churchill's astute use of his press contacts. Under the heading, Mr. Churchill on his fight, more elections than any living man, staunch supporters and a very conservative dog, Churchill describes the progress of his 16th contested parliamentary election. And he starts this article by introducing us to the geographical extent and the rich variety of his constituency. At the London end, it touches Walthamstow and West Ham, with their poverty and their socialism, which, like rickets, is a disease of poverty. Then we come to a belt of black-coated workers and the great prosperous suburban communities of Woodford and Wanstead. Then the houses die away. The primeval glory of Epping Forest enthralls the visitor, and around it and beyond is a large agricultural region with farms and manors, great expanses of commercial glasshouses, a labyrinth of lanes amid green fields, farmers, squires, a county society, foxhounds, and an aerodrome. He praises the efficiency of his local Conservative organisation in writing out by hand the 270,000 addresses required for the free mailings to the 90,000 electors. And he laments the overcrowding at meetings, complaining that the constituency needs 1 or 2 halls capable of holding 6,000 or 7,000 people at a time, which I think is a testament to the change in the political scene. I don't think you'd find many of our politicians complaining that they didn't have enough space. Naturally, he doesn't miss the opportunity to highlight his major national preoccupations at the time, his opposition to the India Bill and the need to strengthen Britain's air defences, and to those we'll return in a moment. But he ends the article with a comic incident, because having been disturbed by the continual barking of a dog during one of his meetings, Churchill had made some disparaging remarks about the dog in his speech, and he then receives the following letter from the owner. Sir, the dog who howled and barked so furiously was my dog. I tender you my sincere apologies for this unwarranted interruption. But the strictures that he was dirty and very likely to place his ballot cross opposite the socialist candidate's name was one, I can assure you, sir, was wholly undeserved. On the contrary, he is a very clean and conservative fellow. It's not stated whether or not the dog in question was a bulldog. The 1931 election leads to a national government led by the Labour politician Ramsay MacDonald, but one which includes prominent Conservatives. It includes Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain. But there was no place for Churchill. Why? Well, serving under a Labour Prime Minister might have been difficult for him after years of strong opposition to socialism, but the real reason is his growing political isolation, because he was a passionate opponent of plans to give greater independence to India, plans that were supported across the political spectrum, including by the Conservative frontbench leadership. And it was Churchill's resignation from the Tory frontbench that led him to appear before the West Essex Conservative Association at Chichester House in Epping on the 23rd of February 1931, where he made the most memorable, controversial and forcible denunciation of the British negotiations with Gandhi. These are the original speech notes, and you can see the famous passage there, or infamous passage there. It's alarming and also nauseating to see Mr. Gandhi, a seditious Middle Temple lawyer, now posing as a fakir of a type well known in the East, striding half naked up the steps of the Viceregal Palace, while he is still organising and conducting a defiant campaign of civil disobedience to parley on equal terms with the representative of the King Emperor. So it's Churchill's views on India that see him sidelined and out of touch, completely out of touch at this point. But he was also increasingly concerned by the neglect of Britain's defences, particularly air defences. And his warnings on this subject increased as the decade progressed and witnessed the rise of Nazi Germany, a powerful new threat to the international order. Churchill's calls for rearmament and his opposition to appeasement are often now presented as the visions of a prophet in the wilderness. People tend to question why he wasn't listened to. Of course, there are many reasons. After the horrors of 1914 to 18, many people from all levels of society and all political backgrounds did not want to contemplate another conflict, while some felt that communism was a greater threat than fascism. But it's also true that Churchill was no longer a front-rank politician, and he was believed by many to hold unrealistic views on empire that made him appear a dinosaur. Some even felt he was grandstanding or seeking to advance his own career at the expense of the existing party leadership. Now, support here in the constituency appears to have held firm at first, but things changed. They changed when Churchill's son Randolph ran as an independent Conservative candidate in Liverpool in the Wavertree by-election of February 1935, splitting the Conservative vote and costing the party the seat. Randolph campaigned against the national government's India bill, and while Churchill's initial reaction may have been to describe his son's decision to stand as a most rash and unconsidered plunge, it was Churchill who gave the eve of poll speech to endorse Randolph's candidature at Wavertree, an action that was bound to enrage those Conservatives faithful to the national government. First to strike here was the president of the Nazing branch, Major Ralph Berry, who passed a resolution deploring Churchill's consistent opposition to the national government. Then the General Committee meeting of the Buckhurst Hill branch of the West Essex Conservative Association passed a resolution instructing their delegates on the Central Council to express their profound disapproval at the recent action of Mr. Winston Churchill in participating in the campaign against the official Conservative candidate at Wavertree, and disapproving of any movement which might split the party. A typescript note in the archive dated 26th of February 1935 from Churchill refers to his copy of this resolution as "this offensive thing from Buckhurst Hill." A similar resolution of no confidence in Churchill was then received from the Epping branch. And with the opposition mounting and gaining coverage in the local press, Churchill and the constituency vice chair, James Hawkey, took the decision to bring things to a head at the annual general meeting of the Central Council. And after 2.5 hours of debate, finally achieved the required vote of confidence. Yet that wasn't the end of the matter. On March the 30th, Churchill received another unpleasant letter. This one was from Sir Fowell Buxton, president of the Waltham Abbey branch of the Conservative Association, expressing his regret that in spite of the recent vote, he could no longer follow Churchill politically. Once again, Churchill's instinct is to attack, and he drafts a letter of reply urging Fowell Buxton to stand down as branch president on the grounds that if you're an opponent of the sitting member, you ought not to remain an office bearer in the association, which has duly reaffirmed its decision to support me. Now, it's not clear whether this letter or a modified version by Hawkey was sent, but it gives a clear insight into Churchill's concern, anger, and determination to fight. Indeed, in a follow-up letter to Hawkey, Churchill refers to the chairman at Walton Abbey, Epping and Nazing, and doesn't mince his words. In my opinion, it is far better to get rid of these dissentients. Let them form a separate branch of their own if they choose. The disagreements rumbled on, but the immediate battle had been won. And it was an important victory, because if Churchill had lost the vote of confidence of his association here in March 1935, he would not have been able to fight the seat as the official Conservative candidate in the general election of November of that year. And without party support, he would have had to have stood as an independent, and he might well have been defeated. The 1935 election was the last general election to be called before the outbreak of the Second World War. If Epping had not voted to keep Churchill at this point, he might have been out of Parliament in 1940 and therefore unavailable for the premiership. There was opposition, but under the firm leadership of Sir Harry Goschen and Sir James Hawkey, Epping kept faith with Churchill. And in fact, the general election provided him with his largest majority. Now I'm going to stop there for the customary 15-minute tea break, and we'll resume with the run-up to the Second World War in a few moments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, well, that was fantastic. That tea and coffee in the back there. And at home, we'll be back after our break.
But yeah, just give me the nod when you think we're ready. And
I found some of our audience lurking behind the bicycle sheds, so there's been a delay in restarting. But I pass you over again to Alan.
okay, everyone hear me? Okay. Well, welcome back. I have to say that I like this idea of doing a lecture in two halves. And I think if the World Cup can have hydration breaks, then probably all lectures and talks should have this. Anyway, I'm going to start again where I left off. And if you remember, we left off in the mid-1930s. So after 1937, Churchill found himself at odds with the new Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. And of course, he was a forthright and famous opponent of Chamberlain's policy of appeasement, of permitting Nazi Germany territorial concessions. First by permitting Anschluss or union with Austria, and then of negotiating over the German-speaking Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. But isolated in Parliament, denied the airwaves by the pro-government BBC, no longer so well connected to the press because of opposition to his views, Epping provides a consistent platform for Churchill to express and explain his concerns. This was one of the few places where he could still find a platform. And so he speaks here regularly, and he speaks in Chingford regularly. I'm going to give you 4 examples. He was here on the 9th of November 1934, and he complained that Parliament was debating an inquiry into the activities of the armaments firms, and he argued that the real inquiry ought to be into the alarming decline of the means of making weapons should danger come. And he contrasted the picture with Germany's production of death-dealing machinery. He was here again on the 8th of October 1935, when he called for support for the League of Nations over the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, arguing that we do not want to have the tragedy of Ethiopia reflected on a gigantic scale in the British Empire. And a year later, on the 19th of October 1936, he was here again, warning that people talk a great deal about collective security. Unhappily, in the present state of the world, collective security is no substitute for national self-defense. While Hitler's move against Czechoslovakia in May 1938 led him to call for real collective security and not a sham, arguing that to go on as they had been doing, a rabble of disorganized and frightened countries thinking only of themselves, was to make war certain, and certain under the most favourable conditions. And it's quite clear from the archives that when he was here in Chingford, Churchill's temporary headquarters was the Royal Forest Hotel. And we have the accounts for some of his dinners here. But it was his constituency as a whole that gave him a voice and which played a key role in the advancement of his anti-appeasement campaign. Let me now give you some extracts from his speech at Faden Boys on the 27th of August, 1938. He began, "It's difficult for us in this ancient forest at Faden Boys, the very name of which carries us back to Norman days, here in the heart of peaceful, law-abiding England, to realise the ferocious passions which are rife in Europe." And then he goes on, "But I must tell you that the whole state of Europe and of the world is moving steadily towards a climax which cannot be long delayed. Such an episode would not simply be an attack upon Czechoslovakia, it would be an outrage against the civilization and freedom of the whole world. Every country would ask itself, whose turn will it be next?" So that's August 1938, and that's vintage Churchill. It prefigures in tone and content the speech he made in Parliament a few months later on the 5th of October 1938, opposing the Munich Agreement. Munich is now seen as a defining moment for Churchill and the country, the moment after which public opinion turns away from appeasement. It's perhaps easy for us to forget that when Chamberlain came back from Munich, waving a piece of paper signed by Hitler and promising peace in our time, having agreed to the German annexation of the Sudetenland, he was greeted as a returning hero by the British public. He even appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace alongside the King. And at that point, it was Churchill who seemed isolated. It was Churchill who was much criticised, both by his opponents on the national stage and by his opponents here in this constituency. Indeed, opposition to Churchill in Epping was welcomed by those in Chamberlain's circle. It's not clear whether or not Downing Street encourages it directly, but they welcome it because Conservatives who spoke out against Winston in Epping would be confident that their actions would do them no harm with the higher echelons of the party. One of Churchill's most vocal critics here was Mr. Fortin Kemsley, who became chairman of the Chigwell branch and who was ultimately rewarded for his loyalty to Chamberlain's government with a seat in Aberdeenshire. And the archive contains a cutting from the Walthamstow Guardian of the 16th of December in 1938, with an article by Fortin Kemsley entitled "Mr. Churchill's Insurrection," which criticises Churchill for his repeated attacks on Chamberlain and asks, should he remain as a Conservative? Now, for Churchill and Fortin Kemsley, the issues surrounding Munich may have been very clear, but for most people, they were much more uncertain and nuanced. And the range of local opinion comes through in a file of constituency correspondence kept by Churchill relating to the Munich crisis, a sort of sample of his postbag, as it were. And it captures the many different views and perspectives of the Epping community, which in turn, I think, serves as a valuable sample and cross-section of wider British society. These are the authentic voices of ordinary people, not the politicians, not the diplomats, not the military chiefs, but those trying to go about their ordinary business at a time of mounting international and national tension. And to me, these letters illustrate one of the real values of the archives. And that value is the ability to strip away the layers of hindsight, subsequent interpretation, and to plunge the reader back into the moment and into the minds and language of the people at the time. So here are some samples from that Churchillian postbag. From Golding's Hill in Loughton. Chamberlain has played Hitler's game for him. The Munich Agreement is the German ultimatum in new dress, and the press says peace. Chamberlain must go. A reversal of this insane policy. Answer President Roosevelt and Monsieur Litvinov's calls for a world conference for peace. Well, Churchill would probably have liked that one. But then from Wanstead. As your constituents, we write to draw your attention to the statement made by Mr. Chamberlain in the House of Commons on September the 29th, that the peace treaties should have been revisited by agreement earlier, and to express the earnest hope that you will use all your influence in the House of Commons towards furthering any endeavours of the government to obtain now a just and lasting settlement of those problems that still constitute a menace to humanity. As the result of Mr. Chamberlain's supreme efforts, we've obtained a respite. If we lose this opportunity, we are unlikely to have another. And a similar note from here in Chingford. Mr. Chamberlain's speech on the wireless this evening has made me realise more than ever that nothing justifies war. I feel that we cannot expect Czechoslovakia to be the only people to make sacrifices. Cannot we do so as well, and thus convince Herr Hitler that we are sincere? Or from North Chingford, the millions of lives that must be sacrificed can never account for the prestige that we may be called upon to lose. Out of the results of such ghastly murder can only come hatred and more struggle. I would urge you to agree that the last fatal step shall not be taken by this country that would plunge us into such utter despair with human nature. What comes through, I think, in these letters is the concern and engagement of the local population. And it's clear from the files that it's becoming more and more difficult for Epping to remain remote from the passions of Europe. One of your more famous residents in the 1930s, and therefore one of Churchill's more prominent constituents, was Sylvia Pankhurst, the former suffragette and former communist, who, despite her left-wing credentials, found herself in agreement with Churchill over their opposition to fascism. And she writes to him regularly throughout the 1930s over her opposition to Italian aggression in Abyssinia and to Franco's forces in Spain. But by the 2nd of July 1937, the problem is really literally in her backyard, because she writes from her home in Woodford Green, "We all know that the fascists have for some time been causing trouble by their attacks on the East End Jews. They have now extended their illegal conduct to this constituency and are defacing public property and are also annoying persons who are opposed to fascism who are not Jews." And she goes on to describe how the fence of my garden facing the road has now been marked across the entire length with chalk, including the words "Mosley will win" and a number of circles enclosing what is supposed to represent a streak of lightning, which was the fascist symbol. She asks Churchill as the local MP to mobilise the police, and he duly contacts the Commissioner of Police, who arranges for the patrolling officers to pay special attention to the matter. Well, in the end, of course, events did conspire against peace. Hitler betrayed his promises at Munich. He occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. And even though some members of the constituency and of the country continued to oppose Churchill, there was a growing consensus that his warnings about Germany had been accurate. And with the outbreak of war in September 1939, Chamberlain really has no choice but to bow to the inevitable and to bring Churchill back into his cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty. And in May 1940, a few months later, the member for Epping becomes Prime Minister. Between 1940 and 1945, Churchill operates on the national and international stage. His constituency affairs are largely, of course, handled by others, by James Hawkey and by the local association, by his private office and by his parliamentary private secretary. Yet the letters from his constituencies were still kept, from his constituents were still kept, and they survive among his papers. And again, they give fascinating snapshots of the home front. In February 1945, a concerned Chingford family wrote movingly about the new menace from the German V rockets. And they wrote, "Do please tell us that some effective steps are being taken to put a stop to these murderous German rockets, which are daily and nightly descending upon us Londoners, killing us and destroying our homes. So far, we've had no assurance from any responsible minister that anything is being done about it. We Londoners can still take it, but after what we've already endured, why should we have to continue to take it at this stage of the war?" Then there's the man from Woodford Green who writes in May 1945 to describe his young son's disappointment at missing Churchill's visit to the constituency. "Our small son, aged 3 years, 10 months, shared our disappointment, as he has always from a very early age shown a great interest in you. For a long time, we were mystified as to why he would put a tea cosy on his head and march round saying, 'Mr. Churchill,' until we discovered he'd seen a picture of you wearing your fur hat." Well, in 1945, the constituency was subdivided and Churchill chose Woodford over Epping. But Epping had served him well. It had given him a political home when his future had looked uncertain. It had sustained him in the face of national and local criticism, and it had given him a platform when he needed it most. In the end, Conservative Epping had proved very tolerant of its independent-minded MP. Churchill was never really a party politician. He may not have been highly involved in local affairs, preferring to leave such matters to his efficient local team, and the efficient constituency files contain a wealth of material on the local history of this area, but he did bring national issues here to Epping. And of course, he did so as president of this branch. Thank you very much.
That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. It really was. I think history should be a delight. And Alan made his account of Churchill a real delight for us this evening, with lots and lots of local connections, many local connections. We must have a drink in the Royal Forest Hotel together in commemoration of one, and a cup of tea by Woodford Wells as well. Right. I think Alan has offered to answer questions. If anybody wishes to ask a question, raise your hand and I will pass the microphone to you.
It's not actually a question, it's just a congratulations to where you've tailored the presentation tonight to us here. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you. You're very kind. I should say I'm greatly helped by the resources that we've got in the Archives Centre. So basically we have a huge electronic catalogue of the Churchill Papers collection, which took 5 archivists 5 years to produce. And I know this because I started my career at the archives as one of those 5 archivists. But it's a huge catalogue, and the great thing about it is that you can type into the catalogue Chingford, or you can type in Nasing or whatever, and it will bring you back entries. So I've been hugely helped with that. But you know, the amazing thing about the Churchill Papers collection is, I think, really that it is such a huge, comprehensive resource. Partly because he used this material, he used it during his lifetime to inform his own articles, his own writings, and his own speeches. But partly, of course, because he knew of its value to his own legacy and kept it with a view to posterity. But it really is the most amazing collection. And sitting right in the middle of it, and often overlooked, is this, you know, section about his time as MP for Epping. So it was a pleasure to be able to look into it.
I noticed when he stayed in the Royal Forest Hotel, his drink bill was the same as his food room.
And that surprised you?
No, it didn't surprise me.
I mean, obviously there are lots and lots of stories about sort of Churchill and drinking, and lots of quotes. I think probably my favourite Churchill quote about drink is he's supposed to have said, "I have taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me." And I guess you don't get to be 90 and to hold high office for half a century without that being true on some level. However, I would qualify this. I mean, sadly now, I think all of Churchill's personal secretaries have passed away, and those who were close to him. But we've got some fascinating oral histories with them, and I was lucky enough to know some of them and to talk to some of them. And if you talk to them about Churchill's drinking and Churchill's smoking, what they would say is that it was certainly true that by modern standards, he's drinking and smoking a lot, but it is moderated. So he would have a glass of whiskey in the morning when he was working on his papers, but it would be whiskey and water, and the whiskey would be progressively diluted. Also, you know, he would have almost constantly a cigar in his mouth, but that cigar would frequently go out, and he would probably spend as much time chewing it as he did smoking it. But he was aware, I think, of the value of the cigar and the image of being a drinker, as the benefit for him as a war leader. You know, it's the sort of image that plays very well with the troops. And he's very conscious when he goes out and he visits the bomb sites or he visits the troops or whatever, that, you know, he makes himself the sort of focus of the war effort, the living embodiment of the war effort. And he does that through his eccentric dress, through the V for Victory salute, through the omnipresent cigar.
Right, Patrick.
Yeah, congratulations on delivering such a 100%, epic speech on Churchill's life, and obviously for being so responsible for all the, the writings that he's carried out for his long life. My question would be, last summer I took my son down to the, Churchill Museum underground, which is obviously adjacent to Downing Street, and they said that Churchill had his own private corridor from his bed. He had a bedroom in the underground subterranean cavern that he used to direct the war, but he never used his private room in there. So my question really is directed towards his health. I mean, obviously it deteriorated, but to what extent was people, the public in general, aware of how ill he was, and what was his actual verdict on his own health? And I think his doctor was it Dr. Moran?
Yeah.
His personal physician who looked after him during the war, from 1940 onwards. I mean, what kind of advice was he being given? And the other question is, how much sleep could Churchill survive on?
Okay, well, I could give a whole lecture in answer to this, and people do write books and give lectures on Churchill's health. There is a very good book that came out not so long ago called Winston Churchill's Illnesses by Alistair Vale and John Scadding, who are two medical consultants who've looked at Churchill's health throughout his life and looked at the treatment he received and sort of attempted to draw conclusions. I don't think there's any doubt that by the end of the Second World War, Churchill was exhausted. I mean, I think anyone who was playing a central role in affairs is pretty much exhausted by that point. And it does undoubtedly take a toll. So in November 1943, after the Tehran conference, he collapses in North Africa. And his doctor, Lord Moran, actually fears that he's close to death at that point. Clementine is summoned to his bedside. It's pneumonia, and of course you're talking about a time before they're prepared to treat with antibiotics. So he's being treated with sulfadiazine. He does come close to death at that point. I don't think he sort of fully recovers from that. If you read the sort of contemporary accounts of Churchill in sort of 1944, there are examples of him having to be carried out of the cabinet war rooms up that steep staircase by the Marine bodyguard at times. So I think he's physically exhausted by the end of the war. The time of the 1945 general election, when he loses that, Clementine Churchill is supposed to have said, "Well, dear, maybe it's a blessing in disguise." To which he's supposed to have replied, "It's certainly effectively disguised to me." But of course, what she meant was that if you carry on, there's a high chance that this is going to kill you. All of that, of course, is kept from the British public, where quite deliberately they're portraying a different image of Churchill as the sort of robust, defiant, resolute, energetic war leader. So there is a disparity between the public projection and his health in private. But just as important to the physical health, I think, is the mental health. People often ask me about Churchill's mental health and this idea that he suffered from a black dog of depression. Different people will give you different answers on this. My own take on it is that Churchill doesn't really suffer from depression as such, but he's one of those people who has to be, if he's awake, he has to be active, has to be doing something. So if he's not involved in politics, he's writing. If he's not writing, he's painting. If he's not painting, he's learning to fly. He always has to be doing something. He seems to require almost sort of constant stimulation if awake. And the moments of depression, I think, or the moments he struggles with, come when that is taken away from him. So it comes in 1915 when he loses office over the Dardanelles affair. He then sort of takes up painting, and then when that doesn't quite work, he goes and commands a battalion on the Western Front. In 1945, when he loses the general election, there are several months before he's able to sort of raise his spirits to deliver the Iron Curtain speech in North America. And it's one of the reasons, I think, why he hangs on for so long in the 1950s as Prime Minister, because he knows that this time there's going to be no way back. So I think there's that aspect to him as well. In terms of his work habits and his sleep, I think one of Churchill's real achievements, if you want a tip of how to improve your productivity, is make everyone else revolve around you. And that's effectively what he does from the very beginning. But I mean, Churchill's preferred day would be to wake at about 7:30, to have breakfast in bed, read all the newspapers and have his official papers brought to him in bed. There would be a secretary taking down notes at the end of the bed. His private secretaries would come into him and work in the bedroom. You can't really imagine a modern politician being able to get away with this. But he would work in bed if he could. Obviously, he can't always. He uses lunches as part of diplomacy to summon people that he wants to speak to. So you would have a working lunch, but it would be a working lunch with alcohol. Then in the afternoon, if he can, he will take a nap. And he believed that you had to do that properly, so that you would have to get dressed for bed. So you would be back into your pajamas, you would go to bed properly for, an hour, something like that. Then you would work in the afternoon, then you would have dinner. He might watch a film as a way of relaxing immediately after dinner, but then when everyone else is going to bed, he and his staff will retire to work through till about 2 or 3 in the morning. And then but that was his preferred, and that suited him. Clementine Churchill's supreme achievement is making that household work around that sort of eccentric lifestyle, I think.
I've just got some comments online. Lee and Matthew, that was brilliant and very moving. Robert Ward, thanks to Alan for a brilliant talk, and actually to us for inviting you. And Simon Garbett, thank you for a first-class presentation, and thank you to everyone for organising again. Sorry.
There is a question. I think the gentleman at the back over there has had his hand up for a while. So.
Steve.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. My question is, do you think, like me, that Churchill is turning in his grave now at the rise of the far right and the neo-Nazi party in so many of the European countries and in America? Thank you.
And I thought I got away with it. Okay, so I'm going to I will give an answer. I'm going to preface this answer. I used to be lucky enough to know Lady Soames, Churchill's daughter. And sometimes I was lucky enough to appear on stage with her on panels and things. And she would often get asked questions like this about what Churchill would think of what was going on today. And her stock answer was always to reply, well, dear, I couldn't possibly comment. He's been dead for 30 years or whatever. And of course, you are talking about someone who is operating in a very different political context. But I think you can talk about sort of general principles. And I think that Churchill would be incredibly disturbed by the polarization that's taking place in political life, both political life in this country and also on the international scene. Because actually, he was someone who always was willing to work with the other side and to work with other partners. People forget that he led a coalition government during the Second World War. He worked very closely with Attlee as his deputy prime minister. he believed in the war in terms of using the best talents that you had to respond to that emergency and bringing people into his cabinet. And he does it again when he's prime minister in the 1950s. He encourages people from outside of mainstream politics, business leaders and so on, to come in and play a role. And on the international scene, yeah, it's true that he said, I think that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. But he did work incredibly hard to maintain that international coalition against fascism. Stalin is supposed to have said that if the big three, so Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill, were the Holy Trinity, then Churchill was the Holy Ghost, because he was the one that was flitting about all the time. And it's true, he was the one that was flying to Washington to see Roosevelt, then flying to Moscow to see Stalin to hold the whole thing together. So, I mean, I think he would be looking for ways of building and maintaining those national and international coalitions, and I'll leave it at that.
Your comment on coalition reminds me that his constituency, Woodford, has not only the great statue of Churchill himself, but a blue plaque to his deputy during the war and the winner of the 45 election, Clement Attlee. Yeah. Do we have any correspondence from Attlee, the constituent, to Churchill?
Well, we've got a lot of correspondence between Churchill and Attlee. I'm not sure it's in the constituency papers. Most of it's in the political papers, but I can give you my favourite example of Churchill and Attlee correspondence. So it's January 1945, and the coalition government is nearing its end. It's quite clear to Churchill and Attlee by this point that there's going to have to be an election after the victory in Europe. And so they're starting to sort of to think ahead and to manoeuvre. And Attlee sits down at his own typewriter and hammers out a 6-page letter that he sends to Churchill. He deliberately doesn't send it through the civil service because he doesn't want other people to send it. He notes it as being very personal. And in this letter, he systematically sets out over 6 pages all the things that he thinks Churchill is doing wrong in running his war cabinet. And he accuses him of not reading the papers before the meetings, of not sticking to the point in the meetings and rambling off. He accuses him particularly of ignoring the war cabinet and paying more attention to prominent conservatives outside the war cabinet. 6 pages, it goes on and on and on. And then you turn the page in the file and you have the reply that Winston Churchill sends to Clement Attlee, which is, "My dear Lord President, I shall always endeavour to profit by your counsels. Yours sincerely, Winston S. Churchill." But that's not the whole story, interestingly, because we know from Jock Colville, Winston Churchill's private secretary, that actually when Churchill received this letter from Attlee, he was absolutely furious and he went ballistic. And he sat down to write a point-by-point rebuttal to Attlee's letter. And actually we have the draft of Churchill's reply in the archive, so we know what he was going to say. But apparently, while he was writing this rebuttal, he rings up Lord Beaverbrook. Lord Beaverbrook is one of those Conservative ministers that Attlee would have been complaining about, one of those Conservatives. And to Churchill's surprise and to Colville's, Beaverbrook says, well, actually, there's probably something in what Mr. Attlee is saying. You can imagine Churchill slamming down the telephone. And according to Colville, at that point, Clementine Churchill makes the mistake of coming into the room. Churchill regales her with this story of the letter that Attlee has just written him. And she says, well, dear, I'm sure he's only trying to do what he thinks is best for himself and his cabinet colleagues. At which point, Churchill just turns to Colville and supposedly says, I'm deserted by my friends and even by my wife. Let us think no more of Attlee or Hitler. Let us go to the movies. And they went off to watch a film.
Right, well, time marches on. Any urgent questions about a speaker? Well, I want to thank Alan again for a very memorable and wonderful talk. Absolutely fabulous evening. The programme was, for this second part of the year, was started by Alison Golter and completed by Joanna Moncrief. And I think she's done a great job, and we have much to look forward to. So July's talk is Eating Out in George in London by Dr. Peter Ross, who I think has spoken to us already. Ah, yes. I've abandoned my duties as the clicker-in-chief. But I've been rescued, which leads me on to my other thanks, which is to Joanna Hammond for proving that this technology can work despite my extreme doubts whether any human being was capable of mastering it. But Joanna Hammond can with Joanna Moncrief. So a big hand to them. Thanks to Francis and Joanna Hammond on the refreshments, and Stephen Pick and our long-suffering treasurer Simon Golter, but for all their their activities this evening. And I thank you all for coming tonight. And I hope you go away with a bit of a smile, as I'm sure I will do. Good night.